So we have artificial intelligence, and we have weapons. And it's very easy to see the two and imagine killer robots that are going to wipe out humanity. And I think that's short-sighted. I think there's another way to see the situation. Let me explain. In the military, it's always had a dialectic between the offensive and the defensive, the sword and the shield. In his book, The AI Age, no less than Henry Kissinger pointed out that some technologies favor the offense and some technologies favor the defense. So in the case of the trebuchet, it's like a catapult, it was an offensive weapon, right? It favors the offense. But of course, fortifications and moats, that was defensive. And if the walls of your castle were high enough, the trebuchet, it didn't matter. So what about artificial intelligence? Does AI favor the offense or the defense? Or is the question a little bit more subtle still? Now, in the case of World War I, that was the moment in which it was the Industrial Revolution meets the military. For the first time, all of the technologies that had been brewing in the 1800s and the early 1900s came to the fore. And so soldiers were just wiped out. The commanders had no time to respond. They didn't even know what to expect at some of these battles. In the case of the Somme, over 100,000 soldiers were injured or killed within the first 24 hours of the engagement. It lasted for about 5 months. Millions of people died. The front lines would change by about 18 kilometers, and the war would continue for another 2 years. The battle had no military significance, no strategic advantage. And of course, we saw all of the technologies flourish in that period, from the machine gun to the tank to the submarine, the airplane and poison gas. And so too, when it comes to artificial intelligence, we can already see that it's the Moore's Law moment of the military, in which we're taking our weapons and adding an AI and internet connection and processor to the armaments that we have. Lethal autonomous weapon systems, laws, ironically named, drones in the Ukraine, armed robots that don't exist, but we can already see it on the frontier, loitering munitions in which they go up into the air and they wait until they see a target and then they swoop in. And by the time you hear it or you see it, it's too late. There's nowhere to hide. Cyber attacks famously, and even the idea of remote product detonations, we don't have a good term for it, for being Hezbollah. But instead of looking at the world and seeing defense tech as a misnomer, as it is, because it's really military tech, not so much defense, you could imagine that we can use these same technologies in the service of peace and the prevention of conflict or the minimization of conflict, rather than just simply blowing each other to smithereens worse than ever. PeaceTech, if you will, is about preventing, mitigating, or resolving conflict. Now, when you add a chip and an internet connection and AI to something, you change that thing. I do not need to tell this audience that, but it's so easy to say, and so often we forget what that actually means. For example, you have a telephone. You make phone calls to other people with a telephone, and then you add a chip, a processor, a connection, maybe some souped-up software like AI, and suddenly you use it, it's a television station. Suddenly it's a radio station. It can do much more still. It's a word processor, it's a typewriter. Your watch used to tell time. Now it tells the time you have left on this earth, because it's an EKG monitor. It measures your pulse, it measures your blood oxygen level. So too, an automobile, when you drove it, looked like one thing, but when it's a self-driving car, it's going to look like something else. You don't need a steering wheel. Why would you have it? So that the passengers can look at each other rather than looking out the window. You don't need windshield wipers unless it's for the amusement of seeing what's outside, because you don't need the human being to know what's going on, because they're not actually driving the car. And so too, the cannonball never had a chip. The howitzer shell was never connected to the internet. But with a drone, that's going to be different. these technologies, all military equipment is going to be connected and online at all times. So what are we going to do with these technologies? So let's take a step back. For centuries, literally centuries, the world has been trying to take off the rough edges of war and create the laws of war, the rules of engagement. Today it goes by the term the international humanitarian law, but one of the earliest forms of this was in the 1100s when the Pope tried to ban the crossbow. It didn't work, and it was only against other Christians. But leave that aside, that it was actually an attempt to find a way to take the technologies and temper them. But if you look at all of the attempts to do it, particularly since the late 1800s, 1860s, when we created the first Geneva Conventions, it breaks down into three main areas: distinction between civilian and combatant, proportionality, that the conflict should be proportionate, not disproportionate, and precaution, that you try to minimize the harm rather than maximize it. It's often been honored in the breach, but at least it's been the aspiration of how to have the laws of war to happen. If you're going to have war, at least find the mechanisms by which both parties can say that we will accept this and not that. So the question then becomes, can we encode the laws of war in military equipment? And I know what you're thinking. It sounds like utopia. Oh, utopia. And I would accept that it is a utopian vision, with one exception. When I look around, there's a whole community of people and of companies working to do something similar to this. Right? And here's a few just behind me. Kvertus is actually a drone company created that's only on the defense. It's based in the Ukraine. It's founded by two doctors. Their goal is to intercept drones and bring them down, enemy drones. As they say, we don't want to kill people, we just want to protect people. And that's what they're doing. Anadir and Culture Pulse are trying to find out what's going on in communities so they can identify crises before it happened and test interventions that might work in a simulation so that negotiators can go in and find ways to prevent conflicts from happening in the first place. HALA Systems has been very successful in doing similar things, but also having early warning systems for airstrikes and other things. So there's a whole coterie of institutions, people, who are all working in the area of peace. But it's possible to go one step further still, to take the metaphor of the sword and the shield and say, well, how can we actually use these technologies in the service of peace, not of war at all? And there, you can imagine, with a little bit of science fiction and a little bit of stretching the imagination, what that might look like, to embed the Geneva Conventions into weapons and gear. So in the case of discrimination, you could imagine a drone that has a geolocation sensor, it already does, that knows where it's flying, that's prevented from flying into an area of civilians and only flies into the area of combat. You could imagine, in terms of proportionality, systems that track the lethality of the conflict, of the intensity, and actually respond in kind and don't try to up it in a disproportionate way. Right now, for example, drones that are flying, you've seen videos of soldiers, Russian soldiers in this case, trying to surrender to the drone. And the drone can't accept a surrender. There's no mechanism by which to do that. Although under the Geneva Conventions, a soldier and soldier's obligated to accept a legitimate surrender by the other side, provided it's not a mechanism by which it's trying to have a counterattack or that you can't reasonably take a prisoner of war. But we don't build that into the military equipment. I would imagine that we could if we tried. In the case of precaution, you could imagine that an image recognition system tries to find the minimal harm it can have. So instead of firing on a combatant in the torso and the head, if it has extremely good accuracy, it should fire people in a non-lethal way, such as in the kneecap or in the leg. It should also be able to identify if the person is wounded, therefore, or to combat, and not fire on the person, which is, again, one of the earliest articles in the Geneva Conventions. So what would that look like in practice? You can imagine that in Africa, at a residential school for girls, the militias are streaming in, kidnapping the children, or worse. and a drone instead hovering up, saying, hey, this is a protected area, you must leave now. And if they disobey, you could imagine the drone firing on the militias that are going to kidnap and rape the girls, and instead fire on them in the leg so it's non-lethal and preventing harm. Now, who would run such a drone? Will it be the UN, the International Red Cross, Grok, OpenAI? These are questions that we're going to have to decide. Right now, there is UN Pro 4, the United Nations Protection Force, that goes into conflict areas as a means of creating safe areas for civilians. Should we actually have something like that with our technologies? And in fact, you could imagine going beyond the paradigm of the dual-use technology, in which we think of military and civilian uses, to triple-use technology, military, civilian, and technologies in the service of peace. So when a defense contractor like Anduril releases Eagle Eyes, a helmet that gives a soldier, in this case an American soldier, the ability to almost see behind walls, they would be able to identify if it's a civilian or a combatant, if it's a person who is injured or not, and respond in kind. This is the panoply of PeaceTech. Right now, it's very modest. It's about conflict prevention, medical assistance, being defensive and intercepting offensive weapons. But even if these things don't work, even if what I've said isn't viable, it's still going to be collecting data. It's going to be monitoring what's happening. And by doing so, it's collecting evidence for a post-conflict reckoning that goes possibly to the International Criminal Court. Now, there's a problem with what I've said. Right? Today, we have human beings who are making these discriminations, and they're obliterating the very notion of minimizing harm to civilians by actually targeting civilians deliberately and blowing them to smithereens. I get it. I read The Economist too. What I am saying, and I'm sure of this, what I'm saying is wrong. It's wrong. I'm positive it's wrong. But there's two ways to be wrong, a little bit and a lot. Both of these charts behind me are wrong, right? The geocentric theory of the universe was wrong. The Earth is not at the center of the solar system. But the Copernican revolution, that diagram is wrong too, right? But one is really completely wrong. And the Copernican system, well, it's not a circular orbit, it's an elliptical orbit. It's only a little wrong. So I am sure I'm only a little wrong. I'm like 99% wrong, and I'm 1% right. And I'm betting that in 6 months, I'm going to be like 98% wrong and 2% right. And a year from now, I'm going to be like 4% right and 96% wrong. And I'm fine with that, because that's exponential growth. And in this community, we all know what exponential growth means. Pacifists should hate what I am saying, in the same way that they rebelled against the Geneva Convention and they disliked the League of Nations, because it legitimated war, it didn't try to undo war. I'm taking the world as it is, not as I'd like it to be. And why is because the day of human beings trying to kill other beings, human beings on a battlefield, are soon going to be over. You will not have a soldier take out a sword or even a gun to shoot another person. They're never even going to see that person. It's going to be a robot against another robot, and humans are going to be slaughtered. Unless the robots themselves, unless the machines understand what international humanitarian law is, as imperfect as it is and as disregarded as it sometimes is. We're in a Toynbean moment. As Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, said, civilizations aren't killed, they commit suicide. Unless a creative minority steps forward to save it, if it is to be saved at all. And there's hope. We've done it before in the 1860s and then again in the 1940s. We created the Geneva Conventions and updated it as recently as 2005. So we've done it before. What I'm saying now is we should take the legal code and translate it into the software code. It sounds preposterous, but So did, in 1868, the idea that you'd have an international institution that would go into the battlefield that neither side would fire upon, that would tend to the wounded from both sides. I'm suggesting a modern update to that. Thanks a lot.